Week 3. You know what this means? This means that if I worked on this project for a week and a half, before starting these development logs, and we've done 3 of them so far. I've been working on this for a month. That seems unreal, honestly. This week we're going to do different things than the 2 weeks prior. 2 weeks prior, I've done little clips or 2 shorter clips throughout the week. This is being recorded just on Friday after the entire week's worth of work. The list is rather long. So let's go through this. I played around a little bit with the temple theme that I've been playing around with. Honestly, just reading that point, it feels like that's a month ago. That was this week. But I decided like temple and jungle and like snowland and grassland and, you know, the Mario themes, they're very, very cliche. And I don't really want to just use those because those are the normal themes, right? It's the first thing that my mind went through, but now thinking a little bit more critically about it, I kind of want the themes for the levels or worlds or whatever to be a little bit more unique. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be one of a kind, but the idea that I talked about last week about a Premiere Pro editing timeline as a level, one of those, it's a great idea. I have a couple of other ideas. I want to work on this a little bit. Then at a cutoff point, I want to go to a different project, do some things there, learn some things there, come back to this and maybe like make the next little bit. And as far as progress with this game goes, I think I have the majority of like the level elements programmed by now. Maybe I'll think of more, but as far as what can you do in a 3D platform, you can make things go up and down, you can make things go sideways, you can go in and out of walls, I suppose. I haven't made that one yet. I still do need to do that. You can rotate around, well, really only 2 axes. You can't really rotate very well diagonally. I mean, I suppose I could try to make something like that if that ended up needing to be made, but it's not really something that I'm looking into. So, to get inspiration, I played a little bit of Crash Bandicoot 1 and 2 to research how that game, because obviously a lot of the level feeling that I'm working on right now is going to be hallway based, and Crash Bandicoot is probably the best example of those kind of levels. So I looked a little bit into that, and I figured I'm going to need enemies. And if I'm going to have enemies, I'm going to need an HP system. So I still do need to implement an HP system. But more importantly, there's some ideas like the rotating platforms came from playing that Crash Bandicoot. But it also was very important for the camera system. Because for the free roaming parts of the game, if those are even going to be remaining in the game, I'm not entirely sure. At the moment, I'm thinking they will, but I might scrap that idea altogether. The camera is just controlled by a mouse and it's good. For the hallway parts of the game, I wanted to have a more on-rails camera. So generally the camera follows you around at a set distance and just updates your left and right position like at the same time, with a little bit of lag behind it actually. But sometimes, you know, when you go over a hill, you want the camera to go up and like look down on you a little bit more for like cinematic purposes, but also for the purposes of not actually clipping through the level geometry. This is kind of important, right? So I needed to get that fixed, and that was an entire. In my notes, I've called it the Camera Saga. That's how big of a deal this was. I've spent multiple days on this, and even now, just before starting to record this at the end of the week, I still was fucking around with the camera system because some things broke. Let's go through it one point at a time, real slow. So I played some Crash Bandicoot 1 and 2 to feel around how the camera works there. And I deduced that at least in Crash Bandicoot 1, it's pretty clearly a system where if you walk into a collision box, the camera moves into a certain new position. And then when you walk out of it, it moves back. Or it moves from collision box to collision box. I couldn't make it so that I can walk from one collision box straight into the next. I always need to reset back to my default position. I could probably figure out how to make like one collision box into the next work. But in general, these collision boxes aren't going to be very close to each other. There's only when there's a change in perspective, like when I want a top-down perspective, or when I want a side-scrolling perspective, or when I just want to move the camera a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, just to dodge some level geometry, that kind of thing. In Crash Bandicoot 2, I noticed the camera movement and was more dynamic and a lot smoother. So I assumed that maybe there was something there, which honestly, it's probably some kind of very clever AI system that I just can't wrap my head around, which does that. But my first idea there was replicating that with going over a spline. If I just let the camera go over a spline and position the camera on the closest point on that spline in regards to my camera, you have a very dynamic camera, right? That is right, until you start jumping. Or at least until you start moving perpendicular to the direction of that spline, if that makes any sense, right? So if I have the spline to my right, if I move from left to right, it sometimes fucks up because just like trigonometry, right? Curves, those points don't exactly line up if you
keep walking straight. The same thing if the camera is above you and you have a little bit of a curve to go with a hill. When you jump, you will suddenly be closer to a point further or way back in the spline.
It's kind of tricky to explain, but it ended up not working out. And I looked at a couple of different other things. I looked into whether or not I could figure out a way to get my own position along a spline, so that I can make an entire spline over the level path and just use that one to calculate my position along the level and then store that into a variable, drive my camera with that one. And while that system would probably work, I couldn't find a good way. I Googled, I couldn't find a good way to get my position along that spline. But the system I have right now works. And I think that is the most important part. The system works and it's fine. So did I miss anything? Yeah, I also added a functionality where I can have the camera within one of these collision boxes be static, because sometimes you might not want to have it move around a lot, right? If you're moving or jumping between moving platforms, it can be really tricky if the camera is also moving a lot. So I added an option where I can just have the camera go into a static place as long as you're in the hitbox, and then the moment you go out of that hitbox, it goes back to the default camera view. I started noting things down in a design document, actually. I need to all gather them in one proper document. At the moment, I just have them in the same notepad as the devlog notes. But beyond all these notes that I'm talking about right now, I actually have like notes of things that I need to make and things that I have made. I should move those into like a Google Drive document. One, because it's better to just have all of that organized. And number two, because right now I'm removing everything that I've already done. So I don't have anything to look back on, which is just not smart altogether. The one thing that I am exceedingly happy with that I made this week is it's a blueprint that I can use to procedurally make rotating platforms. You have a center point, you can choose what geometry you want for that center point, so you can just choose to not put anything in the center, you can choose to put like a pole in the center or something like that, you can choose to anything, any geometry you want, you can put in the center, and then you can also choose the platforms. Which type of platform. So I can literally use this in any theme, in any world, just use different geometry, different meshes, and it will work. You might say, oh, that's fun. You can also procedurally just tell it how many platforms it needs to have. And it will just make those platforms, you give it a rotation speed, you give it a distance for the platforms from the center, and it just does things. And I also made it so that, well, I didn't make it so. It happened to work out this way, that if you rotate it around its own axis 180 degrees, it goes in reverse. So that's really nice. I needed to fuck around a little bit with the construction of the object to make the center point reversible, because sometimes you might want to have like something like a spike or something. And if you reverse the entire object, the spike is suddenly facing the wrong direction. The way I had it set up at first was just rotating the object in the world. Turns out if your character is standing on an object that's rotating, your character actually rotates as well, and that fucks up, at least in the camera system as I have it set up right now. That does fuck up your control direction. It's really weird when that gets like tilted 90 degrees or 180 degrees or like 62 degrees. So I needed to fix that, and I pretty much rewrote the entire object because I couldn't have it rotate. So what it does right now is every game tick, it moves every single platform block along a circle, which was pretty tricky to figure out mathematically speaking. I did have to do a little bit of Googling for that, how it works with like radius multiplied by cosine and all that kind of stuff. Back in high school, I was decent at math, but that's like 10 years ago. So I've forgotten most of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of Googling involved, trying to refresh my memory. Let's see, what do we have right now left? Yeah, okay, so I also made a quick enemy, just a basic enemy that follows a spline that has Goomba behavior, as I call it. It just follows a preset path. It will kill you or damage you when you walk into it, but when you jump on top of it, it'll die. And it'll actually give you a bit of a jump as well, which is very, very fun, because since it's not counted in the actual jumping system, the way the jumping system is set up is you can do a normal jump, and then you have one more action you can do, either a double jump or a mid-air roll. Jumping on an enemy and then getting like the bounce back boost of it doesn't actually count as a jumping action. So you can jump on an enemy and then jump on and then get the little jump boost from that enemy onto the next, onto the next, onto the next, infinite amount of times, as many enemies as there are. And then at the end, you still have your double jump to like mid-air correct to land on a platform, which means that I could, and this was partly inspired by playing Stormy Ascent last week on the gameplay channel, Crash Bandicoot 1's most difficult level, generally speaking. So difficult it was removed from the original version, in fact. Because there you sometimes have to jump on these birds onto the next bird and then land on a platform all on the right timing, which is very, very tricky. But that gave me the idea of potentially using enemies as platforms. That's really, really fun. And doubly dangerous, because usually it's actually not doubly dangerous. if you think about it very critically, it's actually not doubly dangerous, but it feels more dangerous. And I think that is a very important thing, right? Something can be a certain way, but as not even as a game designer, as anybody who creates anything, I would argue, you could call it as an artist. I think how you make your player or how you make your audience feel is very much more important than the objective fact of what is actually happening. You can analyze things to death and say, well, effectively, that's just a moving platform, right? It's a moving platform that admittedly despawns the moment you use it. But how does that differ from platforms that fall out from under you? The answer is it really doesn't in a lot of ways, but it feels more dangerous. And I think that is a very, very good thing. Because it puts people on the edge of the seat, and that's really what we want at the end of the day, I would say. So I'm very happy with that. It's very basic at the moment, but from this basic blueprint, I can start making different types of enemies with different types of behavior, I imagine. We've gotten to the point right now that I have a lot of the functionality, as I said before, for the platforming elements pretty much, if not done, at least usable, right? I might tweak things a little bit going forward, maybe like make them a little bit more optimized, maybe some things end up being slightly glitchy or whatever going forward, and I need to fix that. But generally speaking, everything is usable, and at least for the purposes of designing a level, they can be used. And I would argue that a lot of the elements that I have right now are just downright done. They're good, right? Because they're pretty basic things to make. It's literally just like, okay, you move back and forth. Okay, you move around your own axis. You know what I mean? So there's really very little reason for me anymore not to be actually working on designing levels. And it's fairly intimidating to actually start on that. Because how long do you make a level? How difficult do you make a level? How do you know what the difficulty of a level is? Because if you're working on it, obviously you're going to tend to make it more difficult because you're playing through it like a million times yourself. How do you start constructing a level? How do you decide on the theme for a level? What does a level need a theme? All those questions are things going through my mind right now. And I think a very important part of that is, do I want to make the levels in a abstracted way first? Which means just make it with boxes, just literally with cubes for the purely gameplay experience. Or do I want to immediately jump in and develop the 3D assets that I'm going to be using, or temporary ones most likely, to make the level possibly get a little bit more inspired? Because if you're working with the assets that you're going to be using, there's a good chance that you will be a lot more inspired, right? And you have a better idea of, oh, now I can do this, or now I can do that. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to go about starting the level designs. There's a very big difference between looking at an existing level and telling somebody what I've been doing for a while, and saying this and this and this and this doesn't quite work. Maybe you could do it this and this and this and this way instead. That's one thing to do. But then to start with nothing and come up with those hopefully good ideas, that is an entirely different thing. And I've been making some levels, as you've been able to see over the past couple of weeks, to test out all the mechanics and just to run around a little bit to try to get a feel for the character and the movement and stuff like that, which I think is very, very important. Especially with a platforming game, I think your character feeling satisfying to control is the most important thing. So all that is very good. I have a level set up right now, which is probably the length of a early Crash Bandicoot game level, which is just really a lineup of literally every obstacle that I have made so far, just to run through them all back to back to back to back. Of course, that's not a level. That is literally just a testing ground. A fun testing ground, but it's a testing ground. How do I do better levels? And I think there's a couple of things that I want to do. That is make some kind of stationary level hazard. I think that's important. That's based on the TNT and Nitro from Crash Bandicoot, but I do think that gives a little bit more credence to not just running straight forward, but also not always having to jump. Just having to either jump over a little box, or having to walk left a little bit and then ride like zigzag between them. That does help break up long, straight parts of the level. So I need to have something like that. And then also I want to still make platforms with an on and off switch, because that'll allow you mostly to hide secrets and collectibles, which I need to re-import a collectible that I made as well, because apparently that's not in this project. But that's very nice to be able to hide things, and I think that's also part of that difficulty, right? You can make it very, very, very difficult game, but it's not really what I want to do. I definitely want to make levels and certain like challenges that are going to be very difficult, and for people who have, like me, played Crash Bandicoot and Sonic and those kind of games to death and can dream them. Crash Bandicoot 1, 2, and 3, I can play in my goddamn sleep. Crash Bandicoot 1 is just like not a very well put together game, but that's an entirely different discussion for a different day. But generally, I don't want to make a Super Meat Boy in 3D, right? That's not what I'm doing here. But adding things like that gives optional difficulty. And also opens up level design possibilities. So that's something that I still do want to make. But coming back to the assets. So I'm not entirely sure what I want to do with that. Because I don't want to waste like hours making models and then figure out that I'm not going to use half of them or that I need to replace all of them. I really rather not, because if I'm going to do that, I might as well just do everything by just placing blocks and get a general idea of things. On the other hand, if you make your level with blocks first and then switch them out for actual meshes, some jumps might change a little bit because you're now dealing with different collisions and stuff like that. So in that regard, you have to change the level afterwards rather than change the assets. So maybe it doesn't matter that much. I'm at the moment mostly leaning towards just starting to make the assets and just create the level that I want to create. So that would mean that throughout next week, there's going to be a lot of modeling done more so than programming. But I think that's everything we have for right now. And we've been talking for about half an hour. I don't know if my camera is still recording, so I'm going to end it here. Next week, we'll be back with a new devlog and we'll go into month number 2. I do need to set myself that cutoff point. I think after I've got one entire playable finished level, I'm going to move on to a different thing. I think that's going to be my cutoff point. When I'm satisfied with one level, I go somewhere else. And then probably after that project is done, I'll just do the rest of the world around that theme. But that's looking very, very far into the future. So one thing at a time. And for right now, that's the end of this video. See ya.